Welcome folks back to 2 Degrees Down. We're back here just north of Brisbane in the apartment. And what I'm going to be focusing on now is a new segment besides when I'm traveling or doing the unboxing. So this segment I'm going to be calling Discussions from the Throne. And what we're going to discuss on interesting subjects, and mostly one of my great interests is aviation from my past experience in that. Different aspects of aviation that might interest people who are interested in aviation, people who maybe want to get into aviation, student pilots and that. Just different things that affect helicopters and aircraft, and so that's what this whole section is going to be about. So today what we're going to be looking at, one sort of it's an emergency sort of situation, hazardous condition that happens with helicopters. It's called ground resonance, and we'll just have a discussion about it and what causes it and the recognition of it and the prevention of it. And it's nice to actually know, especially if for somebody who's actually want to get into aviation, or maybe just can't afford to get into aviation but would like to know more about it, because when you just go to an air show, there's just so many people out there who just admire aircraft and probably would like to know a bit more about it, because as soon as you know a little bit more about the different factors that affect the aircraft, you kind of almost appreciate it more, and it's like going to the library or so, you just pick up a book and start learning about a different subject, and you reckon, oh well, I didn't know about that. So keeping focus on ground resonance. What is ground resonance? And what is it to do? It's to do with 3-blade helicopters and more blade. Excuse me. Sweet stuff. Anyway, this ground resonance basically happens on the ground. It's a sort of a hazardous condition that happens on the ground and not in the air, and if not foreseen by the pilot, it can basically lead to destruction of the helicopter, the last event. It sounds very dramatic, which it is if you do not do the corrective actions. But if you do the right thing, you recognize it, you can prevent it happening to further. Like I mentioned before, it's more, or it's prominent with 3-blade and more blade helicopters. And a lot of people might say, oh, why don't you just go to 2-blade helicopters? And a lot of 2-blade helicopters there are. But the problem with 2-blade helicopters, they also have another factors and problems that they have, which they also, a lot of 2-blade helicopters are susceptible to mast bumping, which you do not get on most 3 and more blade helicopters. And that's another whole subject we'll discuss one day. And with 3-blade and more blade helicopters, a lot of the engines and engineers who design it can get a better power to weight ratio. It is a lot more quieter, a lot of instances. And also you are able to design and build a helicopter that can actually fly in extreme or semi-extreme weather conditions, which you could not do with a 2-blade helicopter. So what happens basically with ground resonance? We'll discuss basically what happens with the rotor that causes it, and how we get out of it. Looking at this, basically this is a very primitive diagram I've got here. A 3-blade helicopter system, and if you look at the angular differences between the blades, it's probably 120 degrees angular difference, because we have 360 degrees around the so-called clock. Let's say this one's going in the clockwise direction. A lot of aircraft go anti-clockwise. Let's just get that a bit darker. Pins are terrible. Oh, that's a bit better. So this blade is spinning in a clockwise direction, as seen above. And the angular differences between the three different blades, we have 360 degrees total around, would be 120. 120. And 120. And with this 120 degrees angular difference, what we basically have here, as it's rotating around the hub, we have a so-called balanced blade system. And what I've got here, it's a red circle, that's going to basically represent the center of gravity of this rotor system. So that's where the center of gravity is, where the weight acts around, and it's around the rotor hub. That's where the weight is. Don't confuse maybe the center of gravity of the aircraft, which is the total weight of the aircraft, which would be probably in a different position. We look at the center of gravity of the rotor and the rotor system. So now it's spinning around nicely, in balance, 120 degrees angular difference between the blades. And if we have a situation where there is movement of the blades, because remember, these blades, they're not rigid, they're not fixed, they have dampeners, just like a steering dampener of a car. And with the dampeners, what they do is they reduce vibrations, and they do other factors as well. But you might get a situation, which we'll discuss later, how where you get an angular difference between between those, and there could be a number of factors that could cause that. Now let's say that's not 120 degrees either side there. There's a movement, there's 122, hopefully you can see that, 122 and 118 degrees. And I'm going to exaggerate this with the movement of these blades. If you had to move it right there, as you can see, there's more weight on this side than the other side, so your whole center of gravity would shift down there. Okay, that's very exaggerated, but let's say it's just moved to 180 degrees down here, but there's a shift in the center of gravity. What does that mean? That means you're going to get an unbalanced movement in the so-called rotor system, moving that way, not the other way. And that will start causing a basic vibrations, a wobble, and if not corrected, it will basically cause destruction. I'll just show you a little example of how a disc of imbalance how it actually almost looks. It's very primitive. Here we got a washing basket, lid of a washing basket, and it's all honky-dory here. There's no imbalance. This is so-called a balanced rotor system. As you can see, it rotates nicely with no problem. Now we're going to look at a shift in center of gravity. So what I'm going to do here, get this little figurine here, this little statue, one of my ex-girlfriends, bless her, lovely person, but anyway, let's put him there, the time there. Just like this rotor system, there's a shift of center of gravity. This part of the rotor, so-called, is way heavier. Look what happens. See what happens here? When you spin around, you can see that it's just leaning down on one side, but now you spin it around. Look at that. See what that rotor is doing. Look at him. He's laughing at you. It's going all over the place. And basically, because I'm holding this is a lightweight, I'm holding quite rigid here, because if I didn't, it basically will go all over the place. So if this was a helicopter with this unbalanced rotor system, it will basically cause the mast to start, there'll be a wobble in the whole system, and the rotors will start coming apart, and basically it will crumble apart. So that's a sort of a very simple example. You can do this at home. The whole family can get involved. Look at that. Get the children out of bed, show them that, and the importance of how important to keep a rotor system in balance. Okay, I'll put this aside. Now, what do we want to do? Unfavorable condition, we want to get this back. We want to get the center of gravity back there. Now, we'll discuss that. How does that happen? Having a look at that, what causes that shift of center of gravity? Firstly, the angular difference, then the shift of center of gravity. There's a number of factors that can cause that. Maybe, for example, there is the dampeners on the rotor system. There could be a faulty dampener, and that's why it's imperatively important that the pilot does a thorough pre-flight, inspecting the dampeners, inspecting the oleas, the tire pressures, if it's got wheels and so forth, because that can cause the shift. So basically, let's say dampener fault, tire pressure or olea, tire pressure down. One very common factor is hard landing. Hard landing or misjudged landing, where maybe the pilot slams one skid into the ground or the tire into the ground, can actually cause a jolt in the rotor system. If it's on the ground, then you might get the possibility to get the onset of this ground resonance happening. This people or pilots who actually fly onto ship operations, can lead to this, because this is sheer movement of the ship and the change in pitch of the so-called landing deck can cause a shift in the rotor system. And also another thing is also slope landings. Put it over here, slope landings. Just going to shorten that, slope landings. Because when you land on a basic like a slope, it's going to take that away. Your whole rotor system might be at an angle and can cause a shift. Okay, let's get that back. So those are the factors that basically can cause the onset and the basically change in the degrees of the rotor blades that can lead to ground resonance. What would be what would be for the pilot, what would be the recognition of ground resonance, would be a wobble in the fuselage. And from a wobble to basically uncontrollable situation is in a matter of seconds. So this is why when pilots, when they take off or they land, they actually monitor what's going on at all times. And if they see the onset of this happening, they do the recovery. And what's the recovery? Basically is, let's get that back in the center. The recovery would basically get the helicopter off the ground, and once the helicopter is back into the ground, off the ground, what happens? The rotors realign, the vibrations dissipate through the rotor blades and the undercarriage and everywhere else into the air, and they realign, and the center of gravity basically shifts back where it should be. Then they can hover and re-land somewhere safely and be aware of the situation and put it down safely. There are some very good examples and actually footage of this actually happening in real life on YouTube. I advise you to actually watch it, because I can't actually add this onto this YouTube video of mine because it will be taking other people's work. But there are a couple of examples. The American military actually they took a Chinook, an old Timex Chinook, and they actually did a set example of how quickly ground resonance happens on set and what it does to the Chinook. And basically within a couple of, under a minute, they have this Chinook, which is a Boeing Chinook. I don't know if people know that. It's this huge twin boom, twin rotor system helicopter, and it's mounted to the ground with cables, and with under a minute it's basically self-destructs, comes apart. And that's a very good example you can get on YouTube. There's another fine example of a pilot in America. It was actually a student pilot, and if you YouTube student pilot recovery from ground resonance, it actually happened on his first solo. As he was about to get airborne, you can see the helicopter swaying, and he gets it into the air. And that's the recovery. The recovery method is basically getting the helicopter into the air as quickly as possible. And there's a number of factors that can cause that you're able to do that or not, and we'll discuss that now. Now with a helicopter, to be able to get in the air, you actually have to have this rotor operating at sufficient RPM, and that depends on whatever helicopter you're flying, and it varies different. So unless you've got that RPM at the sufficient RPM, so there's two scenarios. If you got it the sufficient RPM, get it in the air, that will recover it. If you haven't reached the sufficient RPM to hover, or so-called get in the air, your only option is to shut down, drop the collective, shut down, apply a rotor brake if you've got it. And some pilots say that you can try counteract with the cyclic, but so that's a sort of a catch-22 situation of, well, hopefully you're at the operating RPM where you're able to get in the air. If not, well, you're not going to get it up to the RPM. So the best option is just try to get it shut down and stopped as if you're not at the operating RPM. So how does it look in the instruments on the aircraft? You know, that's just a quick little discussion there of, I'm going to draw a very primitive diagram of your rotor RPM here. You basically got a little arc there that's sufficient RPM, because you've got to get this rotor, you got to get it going, you got to get it winded up, you got to get it, they call it your green arc. Sorry, I don't have a green pen. Only got blue. Sorry, Greta, no green today. And there's a little needle that basically, so on startup, you'll be over here. And it takes a little while to get to proficient RPM. So that's a danger zone on startup. When you're starting up, the pilot is monitoring what is going on, waiting for the RPM to build up. And that's why once they've got the RPM built up, it goes through the checks, monitoring, okay, everything's stable. At any time, if there starts an onset of oscillations and increasing, corrective action was to get in the air, and then it will self-correct itself. Same when they're landing as well. You see a lot of pilots, or as they come in landing, you see they landed, they keep the RPM in that safe so-called green zone until everything's stable, especially on a bit of a slope landing, and then slowly bring it down until it's shut down. Well, that's a basic discussion of ground resonance. Thanks for joining me. Add some comments there if you've got anything to add or so forth. It's a nice little topic to discuss, and it's just it's something that it happens once in a while. You know, it's not I don't want to be a prophet of doom. It can happen. I've seen it happen here once here in Australia. It was on news, and I remember my friend from work, she messaged me and said, "Did you see that helicopter itself come apart?" And I said, "Yes, so that's ground resonance." And she was quite surprised that I just recognized it. And you can actually, if you know about it, so it happens very quickly. It's it's one of those things that happen, but as long as you know about it and you do the right thing. Well, give a like, and thanks for joining me.